There's one rule we astronauts have to follow. We don't talk about the first International Space Station. Now, people forget that one of the first things NASA screens for are people who can follow orders. You don't want to know what happens to astronauts who don't, but for our sake, we need to get the word out. The public has to know what they're really doing up here. It was supposed to be the best moment of my life, the moment I had prepared for since I was a kid. As I sit here talking, it's the last memory I'm choosing to remember. I can still remember it all so clearly, the view from the shuttle as we approached the International Space Station too. It was the second greatest sight of my life, only after my first ever look at the Earth from orbit. Ever since I was small, I wanted to be an astronaut. I grew up in D.C. My dad worked in a senator's office as an undersecretary. Mom was working for a nonprofit that provided aid for humanitarian missions. Dad loved museums and science centers and things like that. I was taken to the air and space museums a lot earlier than I probably should have been. Dad always said I'd be doing something with aeronautics from the way my 3-year-old eyes lit up at the display pieces. And from then on, both my parents nurtured my love of flying in outer space. When I was 18, I went into the Air Force. I got my mechanic's license, studied aeronautics, and became an engineer by 24. I was getting ready to work for Boeing or Airbus straight after graduation. But then I received a letter that changed everything. It was from NASA. They wanted me to come work on the brand new International Space Station too. And I was speechless. I went over the letter a million times, trying to believe what I'm reading. And it was a dream come true. I called them immediately, and I told them I would be honored. I spent the next year getting ready to go to space. I thought that boot camp was the toughest thing I'd ever have to go through. It was way worse than the engineering degree for sure. But none of that prepared me for the training I had to do to go to space. There were simulations in zero-G, training with the space shuttle controls, and a rigorous exercise routine. I wasn't there alone either. NASA had 60 candidates competing for 40 spots, but I was told that as long as I passed all the tests, one of those spots was mine. The head of the program was an old airman himself, and he was eager to get the right person in the sky. Now, I wasn't blind to the clear nepotism at work, but I couldn't deny that I was still excited. 14 months, 2 weeks, and 6 days later, I was strapped into a shuttle with the first 8 that would be going up. By that point, going through the launch sequence was second nature. As we launched ourselves out of the Earth's atmosphere and towards the stars, it felt like something I've done my whole life. And when I got my first look at my new home for the next 2 years, I knew I was where I belonged. Now the ISS-2 is larger than the first one. It's capable of holding 4 times as many crew and housing 40 full-time staff. It had been operational for about 5 years at that point. The construction was in the works long before the fatal disaster on the first space station. You could still see the SO-1 out there, floating in reverse orbit from the new station. It looked like a tugboat beside an ocean liner compared to the IS-2. The crew of the second station had been cannibalizing it for parts from what I heard, but they were very careful about what they took and how deep into the station they went. No one was quite sure why. Details of the salvage operation were a closely guarded secret known only to the head of the station, Captain Shaw. The only thing most people knew was that something had happened on the ISS-1 that resulted in the death of 9 crewmen. It was an accident the upper brass weren't interested in repeating, especially when the death toll could be much higher on the new station. As we docked, I couldn't help but watch as the sad old relic drifted by. I wondered if someday someone would look at the station I was now entering and see nothing but a pile of broken metal. Captain Shaw met us in the hangar as we disembarked. He was a middle-aged man. His hair was a blizzard of salt and pepper sculpted into a high, tight, flat top. He surveyed us critically from between a pair of officers in security uniforms. He seemed to approve of what he saw for the most part. He looked like 100 other higher-ups I'd seen in my time in the service. It was comforting in its own way, if that makes any sense. He was a known quantity, and I could work with that. The captain then cleared his throat and addressed us in this big, booming voice. "Good to have you all on board. I am Captain Charles Shaw, and you will all be serving under me for your tour of duty here on the International Space Station 2. This station currently houses 20, And when the 40 of you who passed the screening process get settled in, we will be fully staffed. Some of you will belong to the Engineer Corps under Chief Engineer Roberts. Some of you will work under Dr. Williams in the Science Corps. A few of you will work security under me, personally. But no matter where you work, you should consider yourselves one team and one family. We are all here to help each other and to ensure the safety of this great station. So engineers, follow Vero to your left, science staff to your right, and security staff, well, you're with me. We split off for our respective departments, and so began my first day working in the ISS-2. Roberts is one of the best supervisors I'd ever had and turned out to be another past airman. He was unbelievably calm, and the 15 of us who made up the engineering corps were proud to work under him. He assigned us into 3 main groups, 3 engineers for each wing of the station. We spent our days working like Santa's elves, trying to stay out of sight as we made the repairs that kept the ship floating along. You would think that working on a space station would feel odd, but it's amazing what you can get used to. There's simulated gravity in some of the areas. There are the pods under the rotating rings on the end mostly, but the rest just has you free floating. I was under the engineering corps, so most of my job is just rigging things up and fixing consoles. We go out every now and again to fix problems with the exterior, but spacewalks are harder to get clearance for unless it's an emergency. The station housed around 60 people at any given time. We had a few more from time to time and a few less from time to time, but most of the time there were 35 members of the science team, 15 engineers, 10 security personnel. Why we needed so much security became clear during my first week. The members of the science team were brilliant, but they did get passionate about their work sometimes. Fights were not uncommon, and the security staff was constantly being called to help settle disagreements. For our part, we mostly stayed out of sector drama, but there were more than a few times when the engineers would be witness to some of the more spirited debates from the science team. Speaking of the science team, well, they were the ones doing the real work. I used to love going to the botanical labs to rig up different systems or work on their hydration systems. It was like stepping into a greenhouse back on Earth, and they were always developing something new. Most of it was over my head. My thumbs are greasy as opposed to green, but the gist of it was that they were growing plants that would be able to survive on other planets. The focus currently was Mars, but they were preparing for things like deep space colonization as well. The botanical labs also provided most of the oxygen for the station. They were considered one of the more important sections of the ship. One of my earliest spacewalks was to install thicker siding on that part of the station in case of bombardment by foreign bodies. Besides the botanical labs, there's Lab 2, which served as the engineering bay. This was something I was a little more experienced in. They were working on hypothetical aircraft there, things that could survive in space for long periods and travel long distances on small fuel reserves. A lot of the science was concepts I could understand, but rarely was I asked to design an aircraft on Earth that needed to sustain that amount of pressure. They were building some prototypes on site. My teammates often had to pull me away, so the scientist would stop picking my brain for ideas. Lab 3 was long-term food sustainment, and it was essentially a bunch of engineers trying to make a replicator. All of us had grown up watching Star Trek, and we knew that every spaceship needed a replicator to make meals and snacks and hot Earl Grey tea. They were trying to make a 3D printer for food, but it was hard to decide on a food base that would be easy to store and replicate for long journeys. Lab 4 was focused more on Earth problems and had the usual think tanks for things like pollution and deforestation and such. They were working on compounds for removing oil from seawater, solvents for putting out wildfires, things that seemed to be plaguing people's lives recently. It wasn't a lot of practical work, mostly hypothetical stuff, but they were always hard at it. Finally, Lab 5 was deep space broadcasting, and they seemed to need our help the most. They were trying to get something to return one of their signal, something to return a broadcast. They had so much equipment in there, so much weird tech that always seemed to be breaking, and a lot of it was older stuff that I had no idea how to fix. With all these things to look after, it was no wonder that I blinked and I'd suddenly been in space for 6 months. And that was when they sent us to the S1 for the first time. We arrived at the start of our shift and were told that 4 of us needed to report to Captain Shaw's office. He was reading some reports when the 4 of us arrived. He seemed to be weighing something heavily. He kept looking up at us as he chewed over whatever was in the report before finally steepling his fingers and taking a look at us. I felt extremely judged at that moment, and I found myself hoping that I wasn't in trouble. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is an extremely important job. It will need to be followed to the letter, and there's no wiggle room here. You'll be going back to this if one to remove 3 of the large dishes from the northern face. The broadcast team needs them to replace the ones they lost to debris this morning. Unless we salvage them from the IS-1, it could be 3 weeks before we can get a new one up on the next shuttle. That being said, I need all 4 of you to follow the rules in place for going to the station." He raised a finger, raking us all with his gaze as he prepared to lay it out. "Under no circumstances are you to enter the ISS for any reason. Do your best not to look at the station while you work. Whatever you may or may not see while on the ISS is not to return with you. It is not to be spoken of with anyone and would be best left in the airlock when you return. Understood?" We all nodded, but it seemed pretty weird. What was he worried that we would see? There shouldn't be anything to see on the space station, right? It was abandoned after the disaster, and the only thing to see there should be whatever had been left behind. The more I thought about it, the weirder the request seemed. As we piled into the small shuttle, I expressed my concern to the others. Beside me, there was Rob, Pat, Patty, and Clemens. All solid guys I'd become pretty good friends with. Rob was an engineer from MIT, with a background in aeronautics like me. He was another victim of Lab 2's intense Q&A sessions. Patty was retired from the Navy. He bragged about working on nuclear submarines back in the day. Clemens was in the Army, but he'd done a lot of battlefield engineering in war zones and was good at rigging things up on the fly. They all just shrugged at the question, saying it was probably just something they told everyone. Probably had something to do with the NDAs we'd signed before they sent us up. I mean, at the end of the day, it's his show, Patty said. We gotta play by his rules. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling as we came to the station and docked on the outside. We had about 2 hours before we needed to leave. Plenty of time to do what needed doing. As we disembarked, I remembered feeling a rush of excitement that tamped down on my uneasiness. Spacewalks were always so cool. It's hard to be anxious about anything beyond the quality of your suit while you're floating through the void. We came hopping around the outside of the station, probably looking silly to anything that might have been watching us. We found the first dish pretty easily. Patty set to work with a torch while Rob helped him. Meanwhile, Clemens told me to follow him so we could get the second dish. It was close, but this one was near one of the observation windows. It was hard not to look inside as we got the dish ready to remove it. Behind the glass floated all sorts of discarded items, and as they smacked silently against the pane, I dragged my eyes back to the task at hand. Clemens had lit the torch and was removing the bolts that held the big dish in place. I held on to it, not wanting it to go floating off after it was free. But I found myself glancing back to the window again and again. I could see a teddy bear floating near the glass. Its black button eyes seemed to be begging me to come and rescue it from the station. And then the first bolt went floating off into space as Clemens started on the second. A food bag danced lazily past, the cellophane twinkling a little in the reflected light. "Put your foot down on the left side, please." "It's pulling against the third bolt," Clemens said through the walkie. I did as I was asked, turning back to the task at hand. The arc light made me squint as he cut the third bolt free. I turned away so I wouldn't get a retinal burn. As I did, my gaze went back to the windows of the station, and that was when I saw it. A gray-skinned humanoid, its eyes the color of glaciers, staring out at me from the inside of the International Space Station. Its eyes were no more expressive than the teddy bears had been, but they seemed to stare right through me. I screamed, but it was only heard by me and the void. When the last bolt was removed, I felt a sudden weightlessness take over as the dish that I'd been leaning on suddenly came loose. I tilted, my terror giving me momentum as I tried to flee from the blue-eyed thing behind the glass. As I began to float into the void along with the satellite dish, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop myself. Luckily, Clemens grabbed me by the ankle as I floated past. He yanked me and the dish back from the void. "Easy there, kid. Lose your balance for a second. I looked back at the window, wanting to show him what I'd seen, but it was gone. There was nothing there but floating garbage, and I couldn't help but notice that the bear was gone too. Whatever that thing was, had it been after its teddy, and now neither were anywhere to be found. "Kid," Clemens asked again, "you okay?" I nodded after another second or two. I thanked him for the save and sang, I must have just lost my footing. As we returned to the S2 with our dishes, my head was filled with the image of the creature now, and I had more questions than ever. Someone was waiting for us in the airlock when we returned, and I wasn't surprised to see it was Riley, the chief of security. Riley looked more like a nightclub bouncer than a NASA security officer. He was 6.5 feet of intimidating muscle with arms that would definitely feel cramped in your average spacesuit. Rumors were that he was a Marine who'd been handpicked by Shaw. He answered to the captain and no one else. I knew that my boss was terrified of him. The science lead avoided him at all costs. Other than Shaw, it seemed that no one was in a big hurry to interact with him. He was smiling as he blocked the door to the airlock, but it was hard to miss his hand resting on the lever that would open the hatch and send us all careening into space. Successful trip. He asked Clemens, who happened to be in the lead. Yeah, very. We got all 3 dishes as ordered and we came back early. Terrific, he said, showing way too many teeth. You guys find anything else out there? Bring back any souvenirs by chance? Clemens shook his head. Nope, again, as instructed. Good, good, Riley said, still resting his hand against the pull-down. Head to Deck and Tam, and then get back to work. We'll have a couple guys from Lab 5 come and get those dishes. Can't be too careful after all. He let us pass then, and I saw Clemens sigh deeply when he finally got to the end of the corridor. Apparently, I hadn't been the only one afraid that he would pull that lever. I tried to put whatever I saw out of my mind. Really, I did. But it just wouldn't leave me. Sometimes I would wake up with those piercing blue eyes looking at me from across the void, and I'd remember it all over again. And I just had to know more. I had to figure out what that had been. And my first step was research. The station had a wide array of digital media that could be used for research purposes and work studies. But surprisingly, there was very little info about the first International Space Station. We all knew the story, how they'd been hit by debris when a meteor collided with another passing meteor. The trajectory threw the shards into the station. It had been sudden. The crew had barely known what was going on. The cabin had depressurized far too fast for evacuation to be possible. 7 people had lost their lives that day. 3 women and 4 men. 3 had been Americans, 2 Germans, and 2 from Russia. As I was flipping through the pictures of the deceased, I stopped on one of the Russians. I felt sick as I examined his perfect blue eyes. Yuri had been a scientist studying the effects of zero gravity on a human body. He was also the ship's doctor. He looked miraculously unchanged for a man who had gone through sudden decompression. Other than the graying skin, he was the picture of health. It made me wonder how many others might be in there after they were presumed dead. Were they hiding something in the first ISS? I began quietly making inquiries about the previous crew, but most of the information I got was vague and unreliable. Chief Engineer Roberts had known one of the astronauts, Major Glenn. He was working on some kind of deep space protocol, or something. It was all really hush-hush. But he said NASA was getting ready to attempt manned missions out of our solar system. One of the scientists in Lab 2 said that Drive Haber had discussed a new engine with him once when they'd been searching for research assistants at Boeing. It was supposed to improve space flight and trip time. One of the guys in Lab 3 told me he'd been emailing with engineer Kirst about a new compound for the food printers. Their joint research helped push forward his current project until the incident with ISA-1. I talked to more than a few people, careful about the questions I asked, but I was careful not to let the security staff see me being nosy. I couldn't say why exactly, but after the little incident with Security Chief Riley, I didn't want this falling back into his radar. But I wasn't careful enough, it seemed, because one day I looked up the article about the incident, and I found that it had been altered to remove the names of the deceased. A memo came out a few days later about interest in the old ISS being counterproductive to the current mission. and people were suddenly a little less willing to talk to me about old times and dead friends. It was only a couple weeks later that I found myself face to face with Riley again. I was fixing a console in Lab 5 when I looked up to see him looming over me with a wrench in his hand. Now, he wasn't being threatening, but just the sight of a hulking muscle head lightly tapping a tool against his palm got me on edge. He was smiling too, something I wasn't used to seeing. Riley was the kind of guy I could imagine petting bunnies to death, and not by accident. "Hey there. Heard you've been asking some questions about the old station, Haas." Riley never bothered to learn people's names. Everyone was Sport or Bud or Haas with him, unless you outranked him, and then it was Sir. "Yeah," I said, trying to act nonchalant about it as I finished wiring the console. "Any particular reason?" he asked. "I was just curious," I replied. "Oh, are you writing a book report or something?" "Why does it matter?" I asked, getting a little tired of this. "Well, it matters because Captain Shaw doesn't like it when people look too closely at the ISS incident. He lost a lot of friends on that station. Men and women he knew well. And he doesn't like it when people decide to pick at old wounds. Now, you wouldn't want to make the Cap upset, would you?" I told him I understood, and he left after that. In reality, I only want to learn more now that I knew there was more to the story. Turns out, there was a deeper mystery here than even I was aware of. When I got back to my bunk later that day, there was a note tucked inside the pillow. It read, "Meet me in the East Passage storage room. I have something you might be interested in." I didn't know who'd left it, but it had to be one of the people who bunked here. We were the only ones with keycard access, other than security. So it had to be Rob or Mackie or Davies. I suppose that it could be a trap by security, but why would they bother? Riley had scared me. Wouldn't that be enough? In the end, I decided to go out and see who it was. I mean, what did I really have to lose? The storage rooms were where we kept extra parts and equipment that we might need for certain jobs. Wires, tools, insulation. It was all in here waiting for us. The storage units were not under the areas of artificial gravity, so the bins were topped with plastic covers so they didn't float off. It was spooky inside the East Passage storage, but as the lights came on, I found Davies waiting for me there, looking impatient. Now Davies was an old boot, a guy who had been here before I arrived. He was the right hand of Roberts. We all liked to joke that Davies had been waiting here for them to build the second station. But he definitely knew some things when it came to the crew and the inner workings of the compound. Some even said he'd worked on the original space station before the accident, but no one could verify that. "I heard you've been asking some questions about the old ISS," he said, leaning in close as he floated towards me. He almost whispered then. "Did you see them on the old station?" I didn't have to ask what he meant. I just nodded. He pressed a little notebook into my hand before floating for the door. He didn't say anything else. But when I got back to my bunk and started reading, I realized he didn't need to. Inside was confirmation that I wasn't crazy. There were others in that old station. And Captain Shaw knew. Davies wrote about a meteor that the station had been studying. A meteor with some strange bacteria living in it. The crew had been experimenting with metal in the rock. They were taking all precautions, but accidents still happened. One of the scientists had been exposed to the bacteria. It was Dr. Haber, and his skin had turned gray from it. He was fine, better than ever. But they also discovered that he didn't need to breathe. His new skin was thicker too, not capable of withstanding the vacuum of space indefinitely, but he can survive exposure for quick periods of time. He also needed much less food to sustain his body. Whatever it was, it had changed him on an evolutionary scale. And they were fascinated by it. The crew had been experimenting with this change when they made another discovery. The bacteria was infectious. Soon they all had it. And that was when NASA, specifically Captain Shaw, had decided to quarantine them. The accident had been to cut them off from the rest of the world. But it allowed NASA to experiment on the affected crew. Now Shaw was hoping to test the limits of their affliction and present them to the scientific community as the crew of his new deep space exploration program. They would be the pioneers of the next generation. But at the moment, They were being held in the old ISS like prisoners. That was the real reason we had to take those dishes. They were trying to get messages out to the real world, and Shaw was having trouble keeping them quiet. The journal suggested that I destroy the book after reading, but how could I? It was evidence of what Shaw was doing. I thought I could keep the journal hidden until I could somehow get the word out. I carried it around with me at all times, thinking of what to do next. But after a few weeks, I got complacent. I hadn't seen security following me around, and I hadn't received another visit from Riley. So I thought maybe I had forgotten about it. I forgot how easy it would be to get rid of me and make it look like it was an accident. There was an infinite void to take advantage of. Turns out there were fates worse than that. It all started when I came back to find Davies missing. The story was that he returned to Earth, something to do with his family. But I knew better. Davies didn't have a family on Earth, and the station was his home. I felt a knot growing in my stomach for the rest of the day. And when I settled into bed that night, I wondered how long it would be before they came for me. I didn't have long to wait. I struggled, but the hand over my mouth was clamped down hard. I guessed my crewmates slept through my abduction. They had me in flex cuffs before I could figure out what was happening, but it hardly mattered. Riley had come with 2 other security guys. They manhandled me as easily as they would have a toddler. The corridors were dark as they pushed me through them. I'd never questioned how soundproof the cabins might be, but most of them likely knew better than to mess with the security team either. They took me down to the airlock, and I was afraid for a minute that they would just launch me into space. Captain Shaw was waiting for us there, instead of looking triumphant like I expected. He actually looked disappointed. "Oh, kid, if you wanted to know what was on the old ISS so badly, all you had to do was ask." "I hope your answers were worth it, kid," he said. When Riley shoved me onto the little carrier that we used for missions to the SS, I knew I wasn't getting a quick death. They slid a needle into my neck before they pushed me out the door and towards the opening to the station. I only had to gasp for a few seconds before a gray hand came out to grab me, and Davies pulled me inside the rotting L1. And now I'm a permanent member of the International Space Station 1, and I suppose of the Deep Space Program. Hopefully after they've catapulted us beyond the solar system, someone will find this console entry. I had just finished taking my last final of the year. All my responsibilities were done, all except one. I've been trying and failing to get a job for the summer. This occurred to me again while walking home, ruining my mood. Making my way off campus grounds toward my house, I looked over at the cemetery on the other side of the street. It always seemed a little out of place, sitting between apartment buildings and campus housing. But it wasn't just its location that seemed strange. 4 stone gargoyles stood watch over each corner. The fence surrounding this square plot of land looked to be around 8 or 9 feet tall. And it was no joke. Whoever put it up meant for it to be more than a marker of the cemetery's borders. This fence was built to keep people out. It was on this towering fence where I noticed a new sign posted. I was still across the street, but the giant help wanted sign was easy to see. I'd never seen a sign posted on this fence, adding to my curiosity. I crossed the street to get a better look. Approaching the sign, I read the small wording underneath. See the security booth inside for details. Looking through the fence, I could make out the silhouette of a man inside a small wooden booth. And without hesitation, I went in. The man behind the booth window must have noticed my approach, because he stood up and came outside, facing me with a friendly expression. Though he appeared to be older by the looks of his white hair, he certainly looked energetic and quick. He was wearing this stylish black suit. "How may I help you today?" he asked in a warm tone. "Yeah, I just noticed the sign out there. Is this for some kind of job or something?" I asked, unsure. He bobbed his head up and down. "Of sorts," he responded. I stood in silence as I waited for more details. "Why don't we take a walk?" he added with a small nod of the head and a smirk as he walked past the cemetery path. And I followed, listening as we walked past the rows of headstones. "I don't intend to waste your time, so I'll get to the point. This cemetery has been here for a long time, longer than you might guess. Many keepers have watched over it. This has been my role for more than 40 years, and I don't intend for that to change anytime soon. However, some what you might call extenuating circumstances have dictated that I leave my post for a few days to attend to another matter. And those who I might normally call on in these types of situations are unavailable. The job I'm offering is simple. Act as its keeper for one night and one night only. A night that just so happens to be exactly 1 week from today. I pretty much ignored the first half of what he said entirely. I was more focused on the fact that the job was only for one day. Yeah, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm looking for more of an actual job. One day's work, it's just not enough to... He cut me off quickly. I'm offering $2,000 cash up front, off the books entirely. My mouth hung open for a few seconds, before feelings of disbelief, doubt, and mistrust took over. Yeah, no, I don't think I can do that. None of the university jobs would work like that, That would be unacceptable. He cut me off again. This cemetery isn't owned by the university. If it was up to them, this place would be gone a long time ago. They don't have a say. And thank God for that. I was silent then, unsure of what I just walked into or what was really going on. The man must have sensed this, as his expression changed. My name is Marcus. I suppose it would have been appropriate to start with that. He pulled out a set of keys and extended his hand to me. The choice is yours, but I need you to make it now. I slowly reached out my hand, and I picked up a set of keys without much thought as to what I was agreeing to. Good. Be back here in 1 week at 7 p.m. These keys will get you into my booth. I will leave you a letter. Read it before you start. It will tell you everything you need to know. Your money will be in the drawer next to the chair inside the booth. Marcus turned and walked away, leaving me in the middle of the graveyard, looking down at the set of keys in my hand. I pocketed them and headed for home. Still thinking it over, I considered the possibilities. Worst case, I show up at the cemetery a week from now, get no money, and go back home. In the best case, I walk away with $2,000 for one night's work. What I have to lose? The next few days involved some drinking, celebrating, and a lot of sleeping, followed by a few more days of unsuccessful job hunting. But I wanted to enjoy at least some of my summer before returning to the grind of everyday life. On the day I was supposed to work my shift at the graveyard, I woke up mid-afternoon with the worst headache from the night before. I thought about staying home and hanging with my roommates for another night of drinking instead of walking down to the cemetery for what would probably end up being a scam. But for some unknown reason, seeing those keys that Marcus gave me sitting on my empty desk, it made me want to go. I decided that the 10-minute walk to the cemetery and back was worth seeing if the job was real, and I had found the easiest $2,000 I ever made. Without much else going on, I decided to head out early and arrive at the cemetery around 6:30. I waited around for a few minutes before walking through the cemetery gates. I wanted to look around for anything suspicious. Given the circumstances, who wouldn't? And I found no sign of Marcus or anyone else who might raise an alarm. So I decided to just go for it. I walked with purpose into the cemetery and towards the small booth. I pulled out the set of keys Marcus gave me, and the first key I tried was the right one. I kind of expected them not to work. And I pulled open the door. The small interior appeared simple, but comfortable and clean. It was this small square space. A single chair sat in front of a counter and window. Beside it towered a large wooden cabinet with 2 doors and a lock. After taking a quick look around the room, my eyes fixed on the small drawer below the counter. My heart sped up as I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. I fumbled through the chain of keys, trying each one in the small drawer until one fit. I turned the lock, and I pulled it open to reveal a thick envelope. My hands scrambled to open it, and I counted each fresh $100 bill. $2,000. It added up, and I counted it again just in case, and then again. I checked each bill for any signs of forgery, but it all looked real. I was so concerned about the money, I failed to notice the letter that had fallen out of the envelope until I noticed it laying on the floor. After stuffing the bills into my backpack, I unfolded the letter, and I began to read it. This is what it said. To whom it may concern. Though the job offer to you may seem like nothing more than an opportunity to make a quick buck, the responsibility is far greater than you can imagine. Below, I have left a list of rules. Each is to be followed with extreme care and attention. There are few burial sites in the world as special as this one. The most important thing to remember is this: no one good has ever been buried here. Rule number 1, the gate. This cemetery has one gate, the only way in or out. This gate must be closed by 8 p.m. and kept shut until sunrise. Feel free to shut it sooner. No admittance by anyone, including law enforcement or emergency services, is to be permitted during this time. You, as the temporary keeper of this cemetery, are not allowed to leave these grounds until the sun has risen. The largest key amongst the set you have been given is for this gate. Number 2, the ghost hunters. As a consequence of being located in an urban setting with a younger population, this cemetery is frequently visited by those who call themselves ghost hunters or paranormal investigators. Though the gate should be locked for the majority of your shift, if you spot any such individuals entering or attempting to enter the cemetery grounds, you are to remove them immediately. You are permitted to call on law enforcement for the removal of trespassers. But law enforcement may not set foot inside of the cemetery gates after 8 p.m. Any trespassers out as soon as possible. God only knows what these fools would do if they found something real. Number 3, the suit. Another key on your chain unlocks the wooden closet next to you. Inside are numerous items, one being a suit much like mine and a pair of shoes to accompany them. You must change out of your clothes and into this suit for the remainder of your shift. I have guessed your measurements as closely as I could. It may not be a perfect fit, but it will serve. They must think you're me. You may keep the suit once your shift is over. Number 4, the salt. I have placed white roses on 4 graves within the cemetery. Locate them. Inside the closet alongside the suit, you will notice canisters of salt. After locking the gate, go to these graves and pour a circle of salt around each headstone. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the one thing you must be careful of is to leave a complete circle with no gaps. After doing so, remain as far from these graves as possible and never disturb the salt circle. Keep an extra canister of salt with you at all times. Number 5, the bells. Above a few of the graves, you may notice bells hung up in a string that goes underground. These are remnants of an old practice from hundreds of years ago. Invented as a safety measure for those who have been buried alive, if the body moved, the string would be pulled, the bell would ring, and a watchman such as yourself would know to dig them back up. These bells now serve a different purpose. If you hear a bell, encircle the headstone of said grave with salt, and then keep away from this grave too. There is another possible situation you may face with the bells. If several start ringing at the same time in rapid succession, stop where you are and encircle yourself with salt as fast as you can. Give yourself some room, as you will not be able to leave your circle for a while. Remain perfectly still, and whatever you do not be tricked into leaving or breaking the circle. Number 6, the gargoyles. In each corner of the cemetery, there is a stone gargoyle. All 4 share the same design, a small body with bat-like wings and a devilish face. They sit atop the stone pillars at the corners of the fence. They face inward towards the middle of the cemetery. If you happen to notice that one is missing, disregard it. If you happen to see one in a different place, turn away or close your eyes. Do not give any indication that you know it has moved. They are not a danger as long as you leave them alone. Number 7. Henry. Near the southwest corner of the cemetery sits a weathered headstone marking the grave of an unknown man. The only thing you need to know about Henry is if he rises from his grave on your shift, watch your back and do not go back to the security booth. Inside the front pocket of your suit jacket is a small box of matches. Light one and throw it onto Henry's grave. Pay no attention to Henry if you spot him after you do this. You may then return to the booth. When your shift is over, unlock the gate and leave this set of keys in the drawer. Best wishes and good luck. Marcus. I laughed as I finished reading, enjoying the humor and exaggeration. As funny as I found the effort Marcus had put into this letter, I did decide to follow every rule. Even if this whole thing was a joke, $2,000 was worth it. I began by opening the wooden closet next to me, and on the other side of the door was a suit as Marcus had mentioned. It looked well made and very expensive. I quickly changed out of my clothes and into the suit, and it fit like a glove. I looked at the list once more before folding the letter and stuffing it back into my pocket. Rule number 1, the gate. I figured this would be easy to get out of the way. I grabbed my set of keys and headed out of the booth towards the gate. As I approached, I looked around to see if anyone was watching, and once again, I saw no one. I tried to pull one side of the gate shut with one hand, but it wasn't so easy. The metal gate was incredibly heavy, and pulling it shut took a lot of force. After closing both sides, I found the largest key, and I inserted it into the keyhole, and as I twisted the key, I heard the satisfying noise of the lock mechanism clicking into place. I turned away from the now locked gate, and I pulled out the letter again. I figured the ghost hunter shouldn't be too bad. I assumed they're a frequent problem for Marcus, especially at night. Since I hadn't gotten a good view of the whole cemetery yet, I decided to walk through the area and look for anyone who might still be inside. And while walking, an interesting thought occurred to me. Of the countless times I'd passed the cemetery, I had never noticed a single person inside. At some point, I should have spotted at least one relative that was visiting here, but I'd never seen anyone. I remembered what Marcus had written in his letter. No one good has ever been buried here, and that thought made me uneasy. What did he mean by that? After making a few loops around the cemetery, I felt confident nobody was here, so I headed back to the security booth where I planned to mess around on my phone and maybe read a book. It was on the walk back that I happened to look down and see a white rose on the ground. It was next to a headstone. I casually walked back to the booth and I grabbed a canister of salt before returning to the grave and pouring a circle around it. As I generously salted, I wondered if it would hurt the grass. The grass in the cemetery was perfect, so why would Marcus make me do this? I dodged my own question. I was here to earn money, not to ask questions. After completing the first circle, I moved on to locate and eventually encircle the other 3 graves with salt, making very sure that the circles had no gaps. After all 4 were complete, I went back to the security booth. Reading the letter once more, it seemed I did everything I needed. The gate was shut. The graves were accounted for. And there was nobody else here. And the next several hours went by quietly. I played around on my phone, texted a few friends, and I read a couple of chapters in a book I'd brought. I decided against zoning out and listening to music. Not because I believed a corpse was going to pull the strings on a bell, but because I didn't feel all that comfortable sitting in a dark cemetery alone at night in a lit-up, tiny little booth. Eventually, I got tired of sitting around, and I took a step outside to get some fresh air. There was a cool night breeze. The only sound I could hear was the soft chirping of crickets. I leaned back against the wall, and I took a long sip of my energy drink. And when the sharp, piercing sound of a bell broke the calm silence, it nearly scared me half to death. I dropped the can onto the pavement. The sound came from a short distance away, but I couldn't see its source in the dark. So I got a flashlight from the booth, and I made my way over to the noise. In searching, I found a bell beneath the headstone. I stood in confusion for a moment as I watched the bell rock back and forth, ringing loudly, and then I snapped out of my trance. And I told myself, come on, this had to be Marcus just trying to scare me. But I'll admit, I was kind of scared. So I ran back to the booth for more salt, and I quickly returned, and I poured salt all around the headstone. In the instant the circle had been completed, the bell stopped. I took a step back, and I caught my breath before reassessing the severity of the situation. Deciding that, come on, it wasn't that bad. And feeling like I still had a handle on things, I turned away from the grave, and I took not more than 3 steps before the bell began to ring again. I watched the bell swing back and forth, and then another bell joined in from behind me, this one even more rapid. I didn't even have time to process that before another joined in from down the path, and then again on the opposite side. Only seconds had passed before there were 5, 6, 7 bells, and the combined chimes of them culminated in a deafening noise as they seemed to synchronize, though Marcus's rules never said so. And I felt like they were warning me of something. Without thinking, I quickly opened another canister of salt, and I poured a circle around me, trying to give myself a good 8 or 9 feet of space. But before I could finish it, it ran out. I rushed to spread out the salt I'd already poured to complete the circle, brushing the ground like my life depended on it. It took about 30 seconds, and that seemed very long, but I finally completed the circle. I leaned back, falling to the ground, trying to catch my breath, when suddenly every single bell just stopped. The entire cemetery went silent. Not even the chirps of crickets remained, and I held my breath to avoid making a sound. My eyes darted around, and I kept my head on a swivel, looking for anything. I had this feeling I was being watched, but I couldn't see or hear anything. Eventually, my eyes fell on the corner pillar of the fence in front of me. I stood up, and I looked from one corner to the other. All four were gone, and I didn't have time to process this before a loud scratching captured my attention. I shined my flashlight to the other end of the path behind a tree, and I could see grass being disturbed and dirt flying around. My first instinct was that some sort of gopher had made its way in, and that idea was shattered when a large mass emerged from the ground. I could just see dirt now, and I dared not leave the circle. Everything was silent for a minute or two before I heard a sharp clicking sound from behind a tree, and I saw a figure. It was a corpse, and it was rotted to the bone and limping its way in my direction. It was limping, but it wasn't. When you think of limping, you think of somebody slow. No, this thing, it was limping, but it made its entire way through at a sprinting pace. And as it approached me, my flashlight showed all of it. Blackened pieces of flesh were barely attached to ashen-colored bones. Pale, string-like tendons hung loosely from the corpse, and from its ribcage, shriveled organs dangled and moved. Its skull was missing a jagged piece from the right side, and from its left, a horn protruded, a horn that looked somehow like it belonged. Its jaw and teeth looked perfectly intact, but there was this black liquid oozing and dripping to the ground. As it approached, I looked around for something to grab, somewhere to go. My feet paced back and forth. I wanted to run, but I had to keep myself inside that circle. It walked closer, and then it stopped dead in front of the salt circle. It was right in front of me. I had to catch my balance as I nearly passed out and fell out of the circle. And then again, everything went silent, as the jagged bones from the feet of whatever this was stood on the very edge of the circle. I didn't think a little salt was going to keep it out, and I knew my chances were slim. And then I heard this strong wind sound, and I heard a crash, and I could see stone wings attached to the back of one of the now standing gargoyle statues. And then I saw the three other gargoyles just standing around the corpse, which now lay crumpled on the ground. Remembering Marcus's letter, I pulled it out and I read the sixth rule: turn away and close my eyes. That's all I had to do, and so I did. I heard bones crack and snap and stone pound into the ground. And then I heard flesh being torn away and liquid hitting the grass like water from a sprinkler. I only looked back when the sound stopped, and only one gargoyle was there, its arms holding a pile of bones, the deformed detached skull neatly placed on top. And I looked to the corners of the cemetery to see that the other three gargoyles had made their way back. I turned away from the remaining one, picked up my flashlight, and after a moment of hesitation, I took a step outside of the salt circle. Now I was still shaken by things, but I did decide that the gargoyles weren't going to hurt me. Or at least I'd be fine if I stayed out of their way. I let out a deep breath, and I felt myself get a little calmer. I was walking to the booth and about halfway there, when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, tensing. I knew something was wrong again, and I knew somehow that someone was behind me. I heard laughter then, and giggling. You shouldn't have left your low circle. I slowly turn around, and I show my light on the towering man standing in the darkest part of the cemetery. His thin, scrunched shoulders came up to his skinny head and bounced up and down as he laughed. He looked alive, but his body was deathly skinny and scrunched together somehow. I couldn't see more than his arms and his head, as he wore an old, dull-looking outfit like a farmer. His nails were long and dirty, much like his hands. His green-tinted, poison eyes bulged from his pale head that hung forward. "You better run," the man said. 10. I stood confused. 9. I realized he was counting down. 8. My thoughts went to where Marcus described the location of Henry's grave. I figured this must be Henry, and I booked it for the southwest corner of the cemetery. 7. I had never run so hard in my life. 6. I spotted what looked to be the weathered headstone described in the letter. But before I could tell for sure, I tripped. My knee connected with it head on, and I was sent tumbling. 5. I glanced up at the headstone I was now laying in front of, and it read Henry. Just Henry. This was it. 4. I scrambled for the box of matches in my coat pocket. 3. I pulled them out quickly, but I spilled most of the matches into the grass. 2. I got one, and I lifted it to the matchbox. 1. I struck the match against the box, but it didn't light. I tried again and again. Okay, here I come. And it was a mistake. But I looked back, and I saw Henry's long legs carrying him at a very fast pace in my direction. He'd be on me in less than a second. I kept trying the match, and then a strong thud hit the ground right next to me. I flinched and rolled over, and once again, I was right in front of a gargoyle. All 4 had come down and placed themselves between me and Henry. The 2 in the middle held him in place as he was still trying to grab me, and I took the opportunity to strike the match. No, Henry muttered in fear. Please no. I was just kidding, but I didn't think he was kidding. Henry started screaming then, and I ignored him. I finally struck the match, and I dropped it into the grass in front of me. I fell back as green flames ignited on Henry's grave. He fell silent then, and when I looked back, the gargoyles were gone, and all that remained was Henry standing lifeless, head hanging in defeat. Very relieved, I got back on my feet. I looked away from Henry, and I walked towards the gate. I was tempted to look back, and when I did, he was just gone. I gathered my things from the booth, and I sat with my back against the fence until the sun rose. When it did, I unlocked the gate, and I returned my set of keys to the booth. I walked out of that gate, down the street, and home. I didn't sleep when I got there, and I don't think I slept for days no matter how hard I tried. Over time, it did get better. I still see Marcus at the gates from time to time, and I know he recognizes me. He smiles when he sees me, but I haven't spoken to him since that day. I don't know what I'd say if I did. I haven't said a word about this to any of my roommates or friends either. I don't know how to bring it up. I don't know who in their right mind would even believe me. I worked as a deputy sheriff in a large rural county in Oklahoma a few years ago, and experienced something one night that to this day gives me the chills when I think about it, and it set a course for events that would change my life forever. I've locked it away deep in my mind since then, but this weekend I was going through a box of old cords and electronics I have, and when I saw that old digital camera laying there, it all came flooding back, even though it's been quite a few years. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had as I lay in bed last night, as memories of that night flashed through my mind. During the time of this event, I lived with 2 roommates, and one of them was about to get married to a friend of mine from high school. They were having their engagement party on a Saturday, and even though I had to work all day, I told them I'd be home around 9 p.m. and we'd continue the party as many of our high school friends would be there, and I was looking forward to it. Even my ex-girlfriend Andrea from high school was going to be there, and I was really hoping for a rekindle of romance between us. That Saturday was pretty uneventful work-wise, and the excitement was growing, seeing I had only 2 hours left on my shift and couldn't wait to get off and get back to the house. Dispatch called me on the radio and wanted to know if I could head to a town in the northwest part of our county on a trouble unknown call. The dispatcher asked that I call in on my phone, for she had more info she wanted to speak to me about. I called 10 to 4, and the dispatcher said this is going to sound very weird, but a woman called from a house near this town I was responding to, and was saying a helicopter was flying around her house, shining its spotlight into her windows. I was like, okay. I knew there was not much I could do about it, but I stepped it up because I wanted to see for myself. This town was a good 20-minute drive from my location, and I hoped it was still there when I arrived, because I'd never heard of anything like this before, and really wanted to have a good story to tell when I got home later. I was about 5 miles away when I came over the hill, and I could see lights of the town ahead of me. This lady that called lived about a mile outside of it, and her house sat on a large acreage, which had its own road that ran for about a half mile until it met the main road. It was pretty overgrown and tree covered in that area, but I knew I could see her home from the main road and hoped I could view the helicopter that was lighting up her house. I was now about a quarter of a mile from the turn into her driveway and had a clear view of her house, and as I'm writing this, I could see a long searchlight beam illuminating her top floor window and the beam extending up into darkness. I didn't want a pilot to see me, and I shut off all the lights on my car and rolled down the front windows as I crept up to her private road to her home. And that's when reality hit me. I'd served in the Navy on a naval air station and seen many helicopters coming and going, and as everyone who has ever witnessed one flying over their house knows, they are loud as hell. The problem I had at that moment was there was nothing but silence. No strobe lights, no rotor sounds, nothing but the light. The hair on the back of my neck started to stand up as I pulled closer to the house. Whatever it was just sat there silently, and I sat there a few minutes staring up at it, trying to figure out a reasonable explanation for what I was witnessing. I opened the car door and walked slowly up to the house. I could see lights on the lower floor of the house, and upstairs was dark except for the light beam. I made it to the door and knocked several times, but the lady never came. I pounded on the door, and nothing. I decided to walk back to the car and get on my PA and announce to her I was there, and as I started walking towards the vehicle, the light fixed on me and followed me the entire way. My heart was racing, and I had a pit in my stomach. I'd never experienced anything like this in my entire life. I picked up the mic and said, "Ma'am, this is the sheriff's office. Please come to the door." And then the front door swung open, and a very frightened lady came running to me. She said she was sorry she didn't come when I knocked, but she'd been in her kitchen on the phone with her son when I was at the door, and was too afraid to move, because she heard what sounded like footsteps on her second floor and was scared to death to pass the staircase. She said when she heard me on the loudspeaker, the footsteps stopped, and she decided to run out as fast as she could. By the time the light had fixated itself back on the house, we both stood there staring up at it. I asked her if she'd seen anything like this before, and she said no. I said, "Well, I haven't either, and I'm not really sure what to do here." I reached through the open window of my car and pointed my spotlight at whatever was on the other side of the beam of light, and I could barely make out the end of the object. It looked like the front end of a submarine, black and pointed, but I was unable to see anything else, for my light was not strong enough to see to the other end of it. We kind of just sat there scratching our heads until jokingly I told her I'd get on my PA and tell it to leave. She asked if I could shoot at it, and I said no because it might shoot back at us. I picked the mic up and announced, "I don't know what you are and why you're here, but leave this lady alone and move on." We both kind of laughed, but that laugh turned to shock as the searchlight turned off and we could barely make out the outline of the object in the sky. It sat there for about 10 seconds and then slowly started to drift off to the north. I could only see it moving as it was blocking out the stars behind it, and after a minute or so, it seemed to finally be gone. The lady was still scared to death and really didn't want to go back inside her house, but I told her I'd go with her and clear each room and hopefully she'd be at peace and left alone for the night. The house was quiet and empty of any beings except us, and I told her if you need us again, please call, and even though I'd be off soon, another deputy could respond. She thanked me, and I was on my way. I had this creeped out feeling as I drove down her driveway back to the road, and after clearing off that call, I decided I'd drive into the small town and grab a drink to catch my breath for a minute. When I turned on the main street in town, I could see the general direction towards her house, and it was at that moment I noticed the object was back. I remembered that in my bag I had my digital camera, and I decided I was going to get proof of this so that anyone who called me crazy after this night could be proven wrong by any evidence I was able to get. I radioed dispatch and told them I was returning to the previous caller's address, that the trouble had returned. I asked dispatch for another unit, but unfortunately in rural counties there could only be one or two working, and the other was 40 minutes away and didn't have that kind of time. I hauled ass back to the road in front of the lady's house, and as I came up to the spot before her driveway, I could see the light again plain as day illuminating her house. I jumped out of my car, put the camera on the roof, and pointed it right in the area of the light beam. This camera was pretty advanced for the day and cost me a small fortune, but compared to today's tech, it'd be pretty outdated. I took one picture as normal and couldn't see anything, and started adjusting the exposure and snapping pictures until I could make out the outline of the object. There was that familiar shape like the front end of a submarine, and I could only make out the front part of it where the light was coming from, as the other end of it was still not visible. I was just glad I had something on camera and had something to back up my story. I jumped back into the car and made it up to her driveway, and I could see her near her car with items all over the ground and frantically trying to gather them up and put them in her vehicle. She was in a total state of panic, and I did my best to calm her down, but her hands were trembling so bad that I told her to step back and I'd help her put them in the car. She said she got to her bedroom and was prepared to go to bed when her entire room lit up and she heard pounding on her roof. She said she sprang out of bed and grabbed a few overnight things and planned to stay at her son's home that night. I told her that was probably a good idea and I'd follow her there to make sure she was safe. When we finished loading her items in the car, the light went off again, and I told her not to waste more time. Let's go. We tore out of that driveway, and when we got to her son, he was very confused by all of this, especially now that his mother and a deputy both were at his house clearly shaken. He thanked me for the help, and I left. I made it back to the station and finished a few reports and visited with the dispatchers for a bit. They were both on edge and freaked out after I told them what I just saw, and I made the joke that I'd probably take a lot of ribbing over this incident and fully expected it when I returned to work a couple of days later. I lived about 20 minutes away from the station, and since my shift ended, I headed home. I was having a good time trying to hurry and get to the party, but the events of the night were still heavily on my mind. The area I was driving in is pretty flat, and you can see miles in each direction. I stopped at a stop sign that was on the route, and when I did, I saw a familiar sight. Off about 2 or so miles away, I could see the beam of light shining down on what I thought was a field or pasture. It was slowly drifting in my direction, and I wasn't sure if I should floor it or wait around and see what it does. Stupidly, I waited around to watch because my curiosity was killing me at that point. I remember stepping out of the car and walking up to the barbed wire fence that ran along the length of the road. As the object got closer, I could feel a pounding at the bottom of my throat, and I realized it was my heart. It was about to beat out of my chest, and the next thing I remember was waking up in pain. I was on my back, and my arm was tangled in the barbed wire. The object was gone, and my car was still running, but I had gashes that were bleeding and was able to stumble back to my car and open the first aid kit. I had no idea at that point if anxiety caused me to pass out or if I was affected somehow by the craft. I didn't want to know at that point. I just wanted to get home. I drove home in a daze and was consumed by this strange feeling. I finally pulled up into my driveway, grabbed my bag, and slung my rifle around my neck. Before I opened the front door, I could hear laughter and carry on inside, and knew once they saw me, they were going to think I either got into some serious stuff at work or had an accident. I slowly opened the door, walked in, and threw my bag down, and I heard a loud, "Oh my God." Lane, the nurse, came running up to me and said, "What the hell happened?" I told her it was a bad day at the office and asked her if she would look at these wounds. She said absolutely, and we walked to the kitchen sink where she helped me get the wrap off and clean up the scratches. She told me I was probably okay and could just bandage them up at home without stitches. Everyone was crowding around me trying to find out what happened, and I just sat down pondering whether or not to tell them. I told them they were not going to believe it, but I'd fill them in on the story. My ex-girlfriend sat next to me, and I felt comforted from that and basically relayed every detail of the events of that night. Everyone was speechless, and you could have heard a pin drop until my roommate formed a big smile on his face and said, "No way in hell, dude, just screwing with us." I told him I figured he'd feel that way, but I was about to change his mind because I had photos. I reached into my bag and pulled out my camera, told them if they'd like to see it, then to follow me up to my room. All 5 of them lined up behind me and followed me. Andrea and 2 of the other girls were talking about how freaked out they were, but my roommate was still skeptical. I grabbed the cable and plugged the camera in and started importing the photos. There were 7 of them, and you could see in progression from the first I took to the last how much more detail of the object came out. Everyone was in stunned silence with wide eyes and open mouths. The first question they had was if it followed me home. It could have, I said. Everyone just kind of looked around at each other and then back at me. They asked me what I planned to do next, and I told them nothing. No way in hell was I going to publish these pics, and probably just never speak of it again. I didn't want to be that guy that saw and interacted with a UFO, and I think they all understood that. I unplugged the camera and threw it back in my bag, even though they were all asking for copies of the pictures. I said I'd think about it. Everyone was scared to death now, and they all said they were staying and not leaving. I think they were afraid they would walk outside and a light would shine down on them. Andrea cried out. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she was having to house sit at her parents' house that night because they were out of town and had dogs that needed to be attended to. She was begging her friends to go with her, and none of them would. They were that frightened. I told her I'd be glad to go with her and stay, or we could go and bring the dogs here. She said they were elderly and probably not a good idea to move them from the house, but gladly accepted my offer of staying there with her. She waited for me to shower and change and still had that awful, creepy feeling. I made sure to grab my bag and service weapon, and I followed her to her parents' house just a few miles away. It was very dark when we arrived, and I followed her through the garage into the house. The house was also dark and cold inside, and I couldn't shake that creepy feeling that I had all night. I told her I'd sleep on the couch or wherever, but she said no way. We were sleeping in her room, and that was that. I had a bit of trouble falling asleep, but I finally did and woke up around 3 a.m. alone there. I thought maybe she'd gone to the bathroom, but after about 15 minutes went by, I decided to get up and see where she was. I turned the lights in her room on in the hallway and called out her name, but there was no answer. I made it to the living room, and I heard the back door slide open, and she told me to come out with her. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she'd had trouble sleeping because all she could think about was my story, and she wanted to see it for herself. I was kind of surprised considering how scared she was earlier. She asked if I'd drive her back to the same area I saw the craft because she just had to see it. I didn't want to go back at this hour because this evening had been eventful enough, but she pressed on, and I really wanted to get involved with her again, so I agreed. We loaded up into my truck and started to drive back to the dark rural part of the county, and I was secretly hoping we would see nothing, and I could just put this night behind me. After a half hour or so, we made it to the intersection where I seemed to have passed out. It was dark and quiet, and a light warm breeze blew as I showed her the part of the fence I cut my arm on. We stood out there staring at the sky until 4:30 in the morning. I told her whatever it was is now probably long gone, and we should get back. We started for the truck, and my stomach dropped when I heard her scream. She was pointing towards a large open field where I looked, and I saw 3 bluish lights moving above the dirt. They were circling each other in a quick motion about 100 yards away from us and moving right at us. I told her I didn't like this and we needed to go now, and before we could turn and make it back to the truck, the entire area was lit up in a bright blinding light and what sounded like thunder. I don't remember much after that, except waking up sitting in my truck with her next to me. The sun was now up and the clock showed 6:55 a.m. We sat there for a few minutes in silence, looking around wondering what happened during the last 2 hours. She asked if I'd take her back home, and I said yes because I was exhausted and I felt like I'd just been hit by a truck. I just wanted to get home and sleep. It was all I could think about. I drove her to her parents' house and had to wake her up when we arrived. She got out of the truck and looked at me, hoping I had some kind of answer. But I didn't. We both agreed to meet up at lunchtime and try to make sense of all of it. I drove home in a daze and pulled into the driveway to see an unfamiliar vehicle and my patrol car gone. And this is where things got really strange. I stepped out of the truck and looked around thinking my roommate might have moved the car to the street, but it was nowhere to be found. It might have been very unlike him because he knew he was not allowed to drive it, and he certainly wouldn't have moved it without telling me first. I walked to the front door and my key wouldn't work after trying several times. I banged on the door to try to wake up my roommate, and I was surprised when a man I'd never seen before flung open the door demanding to know why I was on his porch so early in the morning. I asked what the hell he was doing in my house, and he had this dumbfounded look on his face. He asked if I'd been drinking because he'd lived here for the last 15 years, and if I didn't leave, he was going to call the police. I told him he was on my property, and I pulled out my wallet to show him my badge and ID. I'm a Summit County deputy, I explained, and he asked where that was. I told him the county we were in now. He just laughed and said I must be in the wrong state, told me to lay off the drugs and alcohol, and to get the hell off his property. I walked back to the truck to make sure I was at the right house. Sure enough, I was, but things were different. The paint color of the house had changed, and the front yard had much different landscaping. I grabbed my cell phone and tried calling my roommates, but the person on the other end told me I had the wrong number. I tried calling my other roommate, and there was no answer. A man I'd never seen before came out of my neighbor's house with two kids who looked like they were leaving for church service. What the hell is going on? I thought. I immediately thought of my ex-girlfriend. I raced back to her parents' house to find her standing on the sidewalk up the street from her house crying. She told me her key wouldn't work, nor would the garage door code, and when she tried to open the window in her bedroom, she heard a child scream. She said a man came out of the front door with a pistol and told her to get off his damn property before he called the police. She told him it was her parents' house, and he looked at her like she was crazy. She said she looked through the windows on the garage door, and her car wasn't there. I told her to get in the truck, and we'd figure this out. I explained to her that I had the same experience. The roommates were gone, and a different family was living in my house. We tried calling everyone we knew, only to find wrong numbers or numbers that didn't exist at all. I called the sheriff's office and hoped someone familiar would answer, but unfortunately was told no deputy by my name worked there. We drove around a bit, not knowing what to do, and from working in law enforcement, I knew if I'd gone to the police and explained what had happened to us, they'd think I was crazy. At that point, we both realized we were alone, in a strange but familiar place, with nothing, and she started crying. I tried my best to console her, but I too was barely hanging on. We both knew in the back of our heads what had caused this, and we both were hoping it was just a bad dream, and we'd wake up back in our world. But it never happened. It's been 15 years now in this existence, and we had to start from scratch. As the years went by, we would notice many things were the same here, but also some were different, such as businesses and brand names. We used to drive around at night in the country, hoping the craft would come back and take us home. But we never saw it again. All of the proof of the training, studying, and hard work that got us to our positions in our old lives was gone. We stayed together, and we ended up marrying each other, surviving the best we could with what little we had, and with time, built ourselves back up, and we're raising a family now. Life was difficult for many years having to start over, but we did it, and I had almost completely put it out of my mind when I decided to clean out a closet this weekend and opened that old box of electronics and saw that digital camera. I didn't say anything to her because this has all been hard enough on her, and it was just a couple of years ago that she stopped waking up crying in the night. I just sat there and I thought many times over whether to connect this old camera and see if the pictures are still there. I haven't had the nerve to try it yet. I just really miss my friends and family. The last few years have been wild for airline travel. Every week a new viral video shows up on the internet. Some idiot on a plane screaming, shouting, even starting fights with other passengers or crew for no apparent reason. Now I'm sure it's entertaining when you're sitting at home watching these videos. You might laugh or shake your head at the stupidity and not give it a second thought. But that is not an option when you're the one on the job. I can't even count the number of times I've had to call security to deal with a rowdy or violent passenger over the last couple years. Now most of the time what sets people off are surprisingly minor stuff. They want to board now, but it's not their turn, so they start harassing my coworkers. Another passenger looked at them funny, so they get into a screaming match. A baby is crying, or the person in front of them took the last chocolate donut with sprinkles from the airport bakery. So they start throwing punches. You would not believe the stuff I've seen. Needless to say, I got tired of getting up for work, wondering what kind of unhinged maniac was going to cause me a problem today. So I started looking for a new job. My only experience was in the airline industry. I had no problem with relocation, but I didn't want to end up in another large airport. During one 3 a.m. job search, after my long shift at the airport, I found a new job listing. One Pine Airport, a rural airport in the Midwest. I sat up and took another sip of coffee. The pictures for the place made it look tiny. A couple of runways with a single terminal surrounded by forest. Perfect for me, I thought. Fewer people to deal with. I checked out the job details, and to my relief, it was the exact same thing I was doing now. Only difference was that it required frequent night shifts. I'd done plenty of night shifts before, so that made no difference to me. The biggest surprise was the pay. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were offering more than I was being paid now. Suddenly wide awake, I quickly uploaded my resume and filled out all the application questions. I headed to bed hoping that my days at crowded airports might be over. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, I opened my phone to scroll through notifications and check emails, and to my surprise, I had an email from the job I just applied for. The manager requested an interview with me on Zoom. I quickly replied, and we settled on a time during my lunch break. The first few hours of work breezed by, and as I boarded passengers, I couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming interview. When the time came, I was nervous as hell. A bald, well-dressed man joined the Zoom meeting and greeted me with a warm smile. He introduced himself as James. I couldn't have asked for a more friendly guy. He welcomed me, and after some small talk and a few questions about my experience, he gave an overview of the job's details. Mostly the same job I already had with way better pay and more night shift, so no problem for me. After making sure that I knew all the details of the job, James cracked another wide, friendly smile and asked, "Then can you start?" I just about spit out the sip of coffee I'd taken. You wanted to give me a call back later or something. Don't you have more interviews and paperwork waiting to clear?" And James waved his hand dismissively at his webcam. "You're the only applicant, and we couldn't have asked for a better one. As for paperwork, we'll figure that out. The job is yours, whenever you can start. Preferably soon." For the rest of our conversation, James and I reviewed our schedules and set up a start date of just over a week away before ending the call. I sat back in my break room chair with a sigh of disbelief and a chuckle. I'm aware that it's standard to give a 2-week notice to your employer, but I was dying to get the hell out of my current job. At the end of my shift, I let my manager know I had to be gone in a week. Though she was not happy, she assured me it wouldn't be a problem. My final day was absolutely horrible. A couple came up demanding and screaming that I refund their tickets for no apparent reason. On top of that, they still wanted a free flight. After hearing that no, they would not be able to fly for free, the husband and wife both started shouting threats. Security was quickly called to the terminal. As soon as they arrived, I checked my watch to find out that my shift was over. I let out a sigh of relief, and I walked away. As tired as I was with the long drive ahead of me, I was still happier than I had been in a long time. The drive went off without a hitch. I arrived earlier than expected and checked into a motel room. After dumping a few boxes and a suitcase into the room, I turned off the lights and passed out as soon as my head hit the blanket. I woke up that evening to prepare for my first shift. I quickly dressed and started the drive, hoping to arrive early. But I was unfamiliar with the roads, and after a lot of wrong turns, I arrived at the airport with only minutes to spare. The airport was even smaller than I imagined it to be. I quickly walked through the entrance and was greeted by a small security team. After telling them that I was the new employee and James was expecting me, it passed me through. I walked in to find a single empty terminal and James sitting behind a counter at the end. He looked up and he smiled at me. I was about to apologize for being late, but I didn't have a chance. He rushed to show me the employee locker room where my new uniform and badge were waiting. And then he told me to get changed and meet him outside right away. Within a couple of minutes, I walked out to find him back behind the console at the counter gathering his belongings. He thanked me for showing up and starting so soon, and also apologized for not being able to stick around. I have to go now. I've been on duty for 17 hours. I know you're familiar with our systems and software. You know what you're doing. He assured me with a pat on the back before walking out from the desk. He turned and added, "It'll be a quiet night for you anyway. No flight scheduled. Just sit back, relax, and oh yeah, I nearly forgot." He reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of laminated paper, and he held it out in front of me. "Give this a read as soon as you can. Go over it a few times and don't deviate from it." I took it as James started walking toward the exit along with every single one of the security guards and the cashier who had just closed the only shop in the airport. And then I noticed that all the scanners and metal detectors at the security gate were shut off. And I started to panic. Hey, James, where's everybody going?" I shouted. He stopped and turned back to me. "Oh yeah, another thing I ought to have mentioned. You're the only one here at night. Don't worry. Security will be back around 5 a.m. You've got this place to yourself." Grab a magazine from the little store if you get bored. Feel free to snag yourself a couple of snacks too. He began to walk away again before briefly turning and pointing at me. But before you do anything, read that list. You'll need it. I stood and watched as my new boss, along with all the other airport staff, just left. It was hard to wrap my head around the fact that I had an empty airport all to myself for 10 hours, with nothing much to do and no one to deal with and getting paid more money than I'd ever made. I smiled and I turned my attention to the sheet of paper in my hand. James said to follow whatever was on the list, so I figured I'd better take a look. So I got myself some coffee, walked behind the airport counter, and I sank into one of the seats. I took a sip and I finally took a serious look. A total of 6 rules were neatly spaced on the sheet of paper. Number 1, all lights in the airport must stay on at all times. If one is off, or if you accidentally turn one off, turn it back on as soon as possible. If a light seems to be broken, and you are unable to turn it back on, calmly exit the area. Report the outage to James or maintenance when possible. Do not listen to the sounds. Do not listen to the voices. Rule number 2. Rule 2 pertains to rainy or stormy weather. If it's raining or storming outside, disregard rules 3, 4, and 5. They will not be a concern. Stay inside at all times. Do not use the men's restroom during a storm, and avoid going near it entirely if possible. Rule number 3. Sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., a young woman will walk out of the women's restroom. She will enter the terminal and sit, occasionally getting up to walk around or change seats. Her name is Elizabeth. She will attempt to make conversation, but you must not speak to her. You may look at her or give nonverbal communication such as a head nod. You may write her a message or shake her hand, but do not speak to her. If you refuse to speak to her, Elizabeth should be gone in a few hours. If you accidentally speak to her, go to the men's restroom and wait for her to leave. Rule number 4. Between 1 or 2 in the morning, a janitor in blue coveralls will arrive at the front entrance, crack open the door, and ask for his name. If he says his name is Simon, let him in. If he gives you any other name, though, shut the door and lock it without saying another word. If the janitor is Simon, he will attend to the janitorial needs of the airport. If he asks to clean where you are standing, let him. Simon will not interfere with your duties otherwise. He is not hostile or dangerous. Feel free to talk with Simon. He will leave the same way he came in. Rule number 5. At 3 a.m., you may notice that a black and red Cessna Skyhawk has landed on one of the airstrips. You will never see it land, and you will never see it take off. It just appears when you're not looking. After spotting the plane, do not look at it again. Avoid looking in its general direction. There's a picture of this plane displayed inside the terminal behind the counter. Rule number 6. Sometime before dawn, a group of men claiming to be from the TSA may arrive at the airport. They have their own key, and they'll let themselves in. They could be armed. Often, they exhibit panic behavior. They may search the airport, sweep room to room, and ask questions. They are permitted to search anywhere in the main airport building, and you may answer any questions. But under no circumstances are they permitted to enter the skybridge. They will not enter without your consent, and they cannot harm you. Now, after reading this over a few times, I set the laminated sheet down and leaned back into my seat before taking a long sip of coffee, wondering what on earth I had just read. James did not seem to be the imaginative type, and I hadn't taken him to be unprofessional. But as I thought about it, it was unusual how rushed this all seemed. I mean, everybody had left in such a hurry. I started to wonder if maybe I was being pranked. Maybe this was some kind of setup. I ruled that out pretty quickly. This was, in fact, a real airport. I'd done plenty of research by the time I got here. At least a few real flights were coming in or going out every day. James had been working here for years, and I couldn't think of a reason why he would jeopardize his job just to scare me. After chuckling to myself at the absurdity, I decided to give it a try and see what would happen. Maybe it was a test for me as a new employee. Maybe James wanted to see if I could follow orders. After looking at the list again, I realized Rule 2 had a big impact on the number of things I needed to keep track of, so I used my phone to check the forecast. Clear skies, not a chance for rain or storms all night. All right, great, I thought to myself. Now I had to watch out for these Elizabeth and Simon characters to show up, and not be on the lookout for a random plane to appear on the runway. I stood up and grabbed my coffee, walking to the glass planes. I took another sip from my coffee while admiring the lit runways along the airfield. It was a beautiful night, and as I was raising my cup to finish what was left, I heard the click of shoes on the floor somewhere behind me. Startled, I spun around, dropping my cup and spilling what was left of my coffee. At the other end of the terminal stood a young woman, mid-20s would be my guess. She was holding a large leather suitcase in each hand. It had an old-fashioned sense of style with a skirt and heels. She was beautiful, and she had the most welcoming smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to scare you." She expressed it with a sincere tone. I opened my mouth to tell her that everything was just fine, but I stopped myself. I remembered the list. At this point, I was sure she was here at James' request, a paid actor determined to make me break these rules. And I was very determined not to. Instead, I simply straightened up, adjusted my uniform, and I looked back with a smile. She walked to the counter where she placed her leather suitcases on the ground before closing the distance between us. "It looks like we've got this fabulous place all to ourselves. I'm Elizabeth, by the way," she said, reaching out her hand. I shook it, but she didn't seem quite satisfied. "And what's your name?" I continued to smile and make eye contact. Her grin grew for a moment before she said, "You don't seem to be a talkative one." And with that, she turned and walked away. I returned to my seat behind the counter, watching her very closely. Elizabeth made her way to the airport shop, and after a couple of minutes of looking over magazine covers, she returned, carrying a small stack of reading material. She approached my counter and placed a National Geographic magazine in front of me. "I figured you might like this one. Enjoy," she said, winking, before settling on a seat in the first row of the terminal, straight across from me. Her intuition was spot on. I may have lived in cities all of my life, but I love nature. National Geographic was my favorite. I was so tempted to just break the rule and thank her. But I didn't. I stuck to the rule. The next couple of hours were uneventful. Elizabeth and I read our magazines, occasionally looking up at each other to exchange glances and smiles. She attempted to get me to talk at least half a dozen more times. I almost gave in when she asked me if I wanted another magazine. A little past 1:30, I heard a knock at the front entrance. Elizabeth and I both looked before she said, "Oh, that must be the nice cleaner man," before returning to her magazine. I walked over to the front doors, and sure enough, there stood a man around his mid-30s in a blue janitor suit waiting patiently at the door. I unlocked the door and opened it. As he took a step to enter, I remembered the most important detail from Rule 4. I closed the door halfway, and I sternly commanded, "Wait." The man looked up at me with a surprised look. I asked him the question, "What is your name?" The man stared back at me as an innocent smile formed on his face. "My name's Simon," he said excitedly. "I'm the janitor here. Did James let you know I was coming tonight?" I stood there for a moment, thinking over the rule, before I nodded my head and I opened the door to let him in. Once inside, Simon walked with purpose to the janitor's closet, which was near the men's restroom. I kept an eye on him for the next few minutes as he started cleaning, but I eased up once I got the feeling that he really was the janitor. I returned to my counter in the terminal and continued to read. Occasionally, Simon would pass by off to do his duties in some part of the airport, where Elizabeth would stand up to look at the various paintings on display around the terminal. A good half an hour went by before Simon approached the terminal counter with his mop in hand. He seemed to be eyeing up the 2 leather suitcases Elizabeth had set there. Assuming he wanted to clean them, I got up to move them. I grabbed each one by the handle, but I failed to lift them off the ground. Confused, I stepped back to see if they were stuck on something. They were not stuck. Just 2 suitcases left right where Elizabeth had sent them. I tried to lift just one, and again I failed. I tried both hands, putting my back and legs into it, but it still wouldn't budge. I looked back up at Simon, who nodded his head in Elizabeth's direction, and I turned to look at her. When she noticed my stare and my apparent inability to move her luggage, she smiled and stood up. "Oh, let me get that for you." And with ease, she lifted both leather suitcases and moved them closer to her seat before lowering them, this time letting them drop a few inches. When they hit the ground, a boom echoed through the airport and I flinched. I looked back at Simon, who hadn't seemed shocked at all. He just continued to mop. I made my way back to my seat, not taking an eye off Elizabeth for 1 second. "I know it's strange. Just stick to the rules and everything will be just fine. Trust me," he said quietly. I nodded my head in response, and Simon went back to his cleaning. A few minutes passed by before Elizabeth had something new to say. "Oh, what a remarkable aircraft," she said, looking out the glass panes facing the runways. I followed her gaze to the lone black and red airplane. I turned around, looking at the picture displayed behind me. It sure looked like a match. I turned back to the window, and I felt my heart sink. A silhouette of a person now stood next to the plane, facing the airport and the windows of the terminal. "Stop looking at it," Simon muttered from behind me. I looked back at Simon, who quickly cowered, seemingly ashamed to have raised his voice at me. But I was grateful he had. I read over Rule 5 again, specifically where it stated not to look at the plane twice. I muttered insults at myself under my breath, but my heart was pounding. My eyes darted through the other rules. I focused on that sheet of paper. At least it was something to look at instead of that plane outside. This went on for a good 10 minutes or so, and then I started to calm down. I began to pray in my head that whoever and whatever that was would just go away when Elizabeth suddenly approached my counter. I looked up and made eye contact with her. "Hey, I'm going to go get some more reading material, okay? You want another one of those?" she asked, reaching a hand out to my National Geographic magazine. I looked up and nodded, forcing a smile. And as she moved away, my gaze didn't. And once again, I found myself looking at the plane on the runway. The silhouette was now even closer to the building and still staring in my direction. Chills ran up my spine as I snapped my head back to my desk. Moments later, Elizabeth returned and placed a new magazine on the counter before running a hand over my shoulder, seeming to comfort me. And then Simon put his hand on my back. "He'll be gone soon, and so will the plane. Just don't look at it again," he assured me. "Do you mind if I clean here?" he asked. I got up and walked to the end of the counter, watching Simon thoroughly clean the floor before I looked up and let out a soft, "Thank you." He nodded and smiled back. "What did you say?" Elizabeth asked. I turned towards her. Oh, I was just thanking Simon for. My error came to me. Before I could finish speaking, my eyes locked on Elizabeth as she stood up from her seat, her smile fading. Her eyes and nose began to bleed profusely as she started to sob, lightly at first, and then hysterically. She let out a bellowing screech. It was like this mix of pain and anger. She picked up one of her suitcases and she threw it at me. I barely dodged the ridiculously heavy thing before it crashed into the wall behind me. Luckily, I was pretty quick, and I made a run for the men's restroom, remembering rule number 3. But she chased after me. I slammed the door shut in her face and I locked it. Elizabeth pounded on the door with furious anger, but she gave up after a few minutes. "So that's how you dance, is it, love?" "I can play that game," she said before flipping a light switch, turning off the light outside the bathroom. The clicking of her shoes faded away. A few minutes of silence passed before I started to hear laughter from the other side of the door. One voice became 2. 2 voices became 3. And 3 grew to 10. While some continued their hysterical laughing, others began to scream. I slipped to the floor, covering my ears as the voices went on. They only stopped by another flip of a switch. Light beamed from the bottom of the door. "It's over now. She's gone, and so is the plane. I'm about to be leaving soon as well." Simon's calm and friendly voice called out. I slowly exited the bathroom, and I followed him back to the counter, where he made another coffee for me. I wish I could have done more, but you'll come to find out that when Elizabeth is angry, you gotta just let her do her thing. I looked up at him, and I was at a complete loss for words. Over the next few minutes, Simon finished cleaning Elizabeth's blood from the floor before putting everything back into the janitor's closet. He looked down at his watch. All right, I better get out of here. Good luck with the rest of your night, and I hope I'll be seeing you soon, he said, letting out a sigh as he looked at me with pity. I think he knew how shaken up I was. It was like he'd seen this happen to employees before. After I watched him leave, I returned to my seat behind the counter. I started to feel alone, but that wouldn't last long. Only minutes after Simon left, the doors swung open and men in tactical gear, their faces covered in masks and goggles, rushed inside. I sprung up from my seat and I watched as they swept room to room, checking every nook and cranny at gunpoint, completely ignoring me. As they cleaned the entire building, 20 or so armed men made their way to the terminal seating area. A lone man in a suit made his way to the front of the group. I'm with the TSA. I'm going to need you to answer some questions for me, he said. I nodded. All right, how many individuals have you seen in the airport since the security team left the building? Besides myself, 2 inside, 1 outside, I answered more confidently. Okay, was the individual outside next to a black and red Cessna Skyhawk? Yes, I again responded. The man in the suit nodded and paused for a moment before making another demand. All right, well, we're going to need to search the air bridge. I glanced back at the sheet of rules on the counter, and then I took a step forward and straightened my uniform. No, I replied. The man in the suit looked irritated. Okay, if you do not step aside and give us permission to search, I'm afraid I'll have to detain you. Already tired and worn out, I wasn't going to break the last rule. I decided to give a not-so-smart remark to the man in the suit. You're looking a little well-armed for the TSA, wouldn't you say? He ignored my comment. Last chance. Step aside. No. Irritated by my response, the man in the suit turned to his right and raised his chin to give a signal. Gunshots rang out, and I collapsed to the floor. I felt my life leave my body before it all faded to black. And the next thing I remember was the feeling of my hand gripping a water bottle. And then came James' voice. I see you made it through the first night intact. Looks like you got to meet Simon. He's a nice guy. You'll get to like him. And Elizabeth. She's something else, isn't she? I opened my eyes and looked up at James. Am I dead? I asked. James chuckled in return. No, you did great. You're fine. It does look like you might have been a little assertive to our undead TSA Special Forces. I would recommend sticking with a less aggressive tone. Maybe I ought to edit that into the rules. In any case, they can't hurt you, but they can still get a jump out of you. Once again, I was at a loss for words. I slowly made my way back to my feet, and I looked at the sunrise over the airfield. James held out an envelope for me. I opened it, revealing a stack of crisp $100 bills. A little bonus for your first night. It sure is a lot to go through for the first time, but I promise you get used to it all. I turned to James with an angry look, and I finally spoke up. What the hell's wrong with you? What makes you think it's okay to put someone through this without any warning? I am done. Keep your damn money. I'm calling. I started to walk towards the exit when James stepped in front of me. Look, I know it isn't fair for you, but it wasn't fair for me either. It wasn't fair for any of us. It's not okay. I know, but what can I do? Someone needs to be here for the night shift. You wouldn't have believed any of this if I told you ahead of time. You'd have thought I was some kind of nut job. And the police will think the same of you if you tell them. I needed you to see for yourself. James stopped for a moment to catch his breath before continuing. Look, the money is yours. No strings attached. You're free to leave now and never come back. There's no shame in it. I also started to calm down, but I couldn't bring myself to look James in the eye. If you do choose to stay, I'll see you in my office to finish up your paperwork. And with that, James just walked away. Facing the front of the airport, I watched the first passengers of the day come through the entrance. I just stood there for a few minutes, thinking. I sure as hell wasn't going back to another overcrowded city airport. Maybe I could get used to this. I finally turned around, and I walked back to his office. It was a beautiful day in the fall, And though being in the middle of nowhere in Ohio isn't exactly my ideal setting for an assignment, it could have been worse. Opening my windows, listening to music, and getting a good whiff of country air is a nice contrast to being cooped up in cities like I'm used to. The sight of brown stalks of corn populating the miles of field along the road was welcome, as was the cool and clean smell of the air. It's a good thing these jobs don't involve much interaction with people. Unfortunately, some level of interaction is inevitable. On my way to this one, I got a speeding ticket from a cop at some little local department. Though I was, in fact, speeding, I got the feeling that he also didn't so much like seeing a feed in his neck of the woods. The local police aren't a fan of us, so I've come to learn. They tend to get suspicious of us, thinking we're up to some top-secret mission behind their backs. I guess they would be right. I kept driving down the gravel road until the navigation let me know my destination was coming up on the right. Turning down the radio as I approached, I glanced toward the empty fields and the woods that met them beyond. I then turned into the long dirt driveway leading to our civilian's house and garage. I rolled up and parked with my trunk facing the porch. Stepping out, I got another whiff of the fresh country air, and I looked at the area of operations that lay before me. I was surprised at the amount of land and space that I had at my disposal. Space is good for these jobs. Additionally, I was informed that there weren't any neighbors close enough to worry about. I couldn't have asked for a better setting. After stretching and letting out a light sigh, I decided it was time to get to work. I pulled the keychain out of my pocket and unlocked the front door. It seemed like a nice enough place. It was certainly nothing worth complaining about, given the conditions of houses I've faced in my previous assignments. I went back outside to my massive government-issued vehicle and opened the trunk. I pulled the first couple of duffel bags worth of equipment out and brought them inside. The kitchen was as good a place as any to set up. After making 5 or 6 trips, dragging heavy bags and boxes of my junk into the house, I went back outside to open the garage. Thank God we were able to catch this case early, and the civilians were able to make it out in time. It also meant I got a rim in the garage to park this thing. All that remained in the truck was the large metallic box, but I wasn't going to need that until later. I shut the trunk and pulled my vehicle into the garage, closing it on my way out. I stepped back into the house where I changed from my suit to my gear. Wearing the suit all day annoys me, but I suppose the higher-ups want us to look like good, friendly feds to the public. The public has no idea what kind of monsters we are. I unpacked box after box of equipment and weapons. I loaded up my Glock 17 with its extended 30-round magazine, just as I did with my rifle. I checked the laser sights on both. All good. Next was my favorite, the best scope you could ever ask for. It's nice to have a virtually infinite budget. Perks of working for the U.S. federal government, I suppose. The final firearm I brought was my personal .357 Magnum revolver that I kept holstered on my chest. I figure it's never a bad idea to have one more gun, just in case. Maybe I should have brought more on this one. If things got too close, I always had my hunting knife. I sharpened it that morning before heading out. The next few hours consisted of me going out into the woods near the house in various places and setting up dozens of my little cameras equipped with motion sensors. They were there to give me an idea of the location of anything that got brave enough to get close to the fields that surrounded the house. I'd be able to know about anything that was coming to me. I didn't take too much caution in setting things up. Things never get interesting until nightfall. I returned to the house where I turned on my laptop and assured that all cameras were connected and working. I could see every single one of them from there and would know if anything moved so much as moved. I then got situated on a chair by the kitchen table where I opened the window and set up my rifle to watch the fields. I suppose it would be worth mentioning why I'm out here, setting up my fancy equipment in the woods and loading up an arsenal of guns while I'm alone in a farmhouse that isn't mine. Let's back things up. March 1st, 2017, 3:33 a.m. Iowa. Dispatch gets a call from a local farmer. It claims to be looking at a figure standing still at the edge of a tree line on his property. The description given by the farmer was that of a man of average stature and build, clothed in a loose black or gray shirt and trousers and a large brimmed hat. The farmer tells dispatch that he'd awoken abruptly roughly an hour earlier, unspecified as to why. He spotted the figure outside his kitchen window soon after. The figure had been standing near the edge of a row of trees. It was facing the house. It hadn't moved a muscle since the farmer noticed him. The farmer quickly retrieved his rifle and walked out onto his lawn, proceeding to brandish his firearm and tell the trespasser that his property was his and to leave immediately. The farmer, seeing that the man remained unthreatened by his warning and display of a firearm, retreated back into his home to retrieve his phone and call 911 as he continued to watch the figure from his porch. During this call, the farmer's voice was noticeably nervous and frightened. The desperate tone and quivering speech continued to worsen as he went on explaining the situation to dispatch. Dispatch instructed the farmer to remain where he stood and not to approach the trespasser. Dispatch reassured the farmer that the police were on their way. A few quiet and uneventful minutes passed. Then, without warning, the farmer let out a horrified scream through the phone. The call was disconnected seconds later. The police began their over 40-minute drive to the residence, halfway to their arrival. Multiple new calls were coming to dispatch from the farmer's neighbors. They reported seeing a large stack of smoke coming from the farmer's home, and the closest reported seeing the house on fire. By the time police arrived, the house had burned to the ground. The fire department arrived shortly after, but oddly enough, the fire had completely subsided. What remained was the charred crumbs of what once was a house. The firefighters that arrived on site were bewildered by how quickly the fire must have burned the house. There was no explanation they could fathom. The police searched the nearby fields and woods for the farmer and alleged trespasser, to no avail. However, their search was quickly called back upon the findings of the firefighters in the house. The man's charred bones were found beneath the rubble, but not as they should have been. It became clear after further investigation that the man's limbs were ripped from his body before it was incinerated at an impossible speed. 4 bullet casings were found where the porch of the house used to be. The rifle was found just outside of the house, unscathed despite its proximity to such a violent fire. Forensics confirmed that the rifle had fired these casings, but the bullets themselves were never found. This was the first, but far from the last. October 28, 2017, 11:07 p.m. Montana. Dispatch gets a call from a ranger who spotted a woman in an old-fashioned black and white dress and wearing a linen cap. The rancher claimed the woman was standing amongst his cattle and not moving. The rancher expressed no panic or concern for his safety over the phone, but rather a concern for the woman in the field. The rancher also noted that his cattle kept their distance around the woman. An ambulance arrived at 11:29. Paramedics found no trace of the alleged woman. They walked to the entrance of the rancher's house and discovered his door to be unlocked and open. After calling for the rancher and getting no response, they stepped inside to be greeted by the corpse of the rancher, hanging from a noose in his stairwell. The man had no history of mental illness, and none of his relatives or acquaintances had any reason to believe he was suicidal. Additionally, an autopsy report concluded that both arms were broken in multiple places, as well as every finger, as if they'd been crumpled together by great force. He could not have tied the noose himself. November 29, 2018, 2:06 a.m., Wisconsin. Dispatch gets a call from another farmer. He'd spotted a woman in an old black and white dress and linen cap. The woman had been standing in the long driveway from the road to his house, lit by the lamp that covered it. She stood motionless in the cold, windy, and heavily snowing weather. The farmer and his wife were later found under a collapsed wall of their crumpled house, with stones placed on top. They'd been placed in a seemingly orderly fashion until there was enough weight to crush their bones. This happens to be the first incident we have on record with photo evidence. A trail cam owned by the farmer and his wife a few acres away from the house caught a picture the night of the incident. It caught a picture of the woman exactly as the farmer had described, black and white dress, white linen cap. It looked as though she'd stepped through time from hundreds of years before and was placed like a mannequin in front of the camera. May 30th, 2019, Minnesota. September 3rd, 2019, Nebraska. January 4th, 2020, South Dakota. I could go on, but the point is that these incidents have been happening more and more frequently, and they aren't stopping. We do know what they are, or at least what they're supposed to represent to us. Every single one of these people lived in North America during the witch trials. We don't believe they were the ones who were executed. We believe they were the ones who made the accusations, the ones who got their neighbors killed, the ones who carried out the executions, and now they're back to kill again. Luckily, my department picked up on these patterns early on and designated a team to deal with them. There are a few hundred of us. I'm in the dark about what everyone does exactly. I haven't met many, but I do know that. Some find potential incidents. Some investigate. Some deal with the cover-up and handling the publicity. And then, of course, they're the ones you send in to eradicate the problem. That's where I come in. I'm here to hunt them down, to put them back in their graves, so it would seem. Sometimes I get here before they've claimed a victim. Sometimes after. But their reign of terror comes to an end with me. They've never gotten away from me. And I have never failed an assignment. I didn't plan on this night being any different. A beep sounded from my laptop screen as an outline from one of the cameras lit up, indicating that the motion sensor detected movement. It had been quiet since I set it up there. There was not even the slightest sign of wildlife. No deer, no squirrels. Nothing. I leaned forward and intently examined the camera that had been triggered. There was nothing to see. Another sensor triggered. Again, the camera showed nothing. My eyes darted from camera to camera, looking for motion. Another camera triggered, though all that I caught sight of was a shaking tree branch. There was no wind today. Another, and this time I saw it. A dog-looking figure darted across the camera in only a few frames, but I knew it was no dog. I turned my attention from the cameras to the field in front of me, where the movement had come from. I got behind my rifle and looked down the scope to the tree line in the distance. My heart began to pound in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in while I scanned the edge of the field for movement. All that greeted me was the orange glint of the setting sun on the tree line, the tiny shadows of the little stumps of corn stalks in the otherwise empty field. It was silent. Not even wind this evening. Though I can't complain. It's better for shooting. For a few minutes, I continued to run my scope along the tree line, occasionally getting a peek with my own eyes. It was during one of these peeks when I noticed a color out of place in between a couple trees on the other side of the field, some sort of black and white speck that wasn't there a second before. I lowered my head down, back behind the scope, and centered it. As I steadied the scope, a man-like figure standing at the edge of the field came into focus. It wore black, tattered rags of clothing that hung loosely on its rigid frame. It stood still, stiff as a board. Its eyes were fixed on something ahead of it. It took me a moment to realize it was focused on me. It didn't move a muscle, not even blinking as it stared. I came to my senses and prepared to do my job. I flipped the safety off of my rifle and centered my crosshairs on its chest. I began to breathe deeply, my finger on the trigger, ready to pull, but I didn't take the shot. Not yet. I saw it start to move. Even with the distance between us, my scope made the picture of this figure clear as day. The movement came from only one part of its body. Its mouth. First, its crusty lips detached from one another, and the mouth began to open. Steadily, it opened more and more. All the while, the rest of its body and head remained fixed. Its jaw sank to what should have been all the more it could, but it didn't stop. It fell further, dipping down below its chest, its skin like a stretched rubber band waiting to snap. Though it didn't. It kept stretching. Still stiff as a board, the man-like thing remained with its eyes locked on me, while its mouth sat open, impossibly wide. It stood still with its hanging jaw for a moment I shouldn't have given it. Now I knew I had my target. I began to apply pressure to the trigger before I was stopped, shaken by a force. A scream, like the choir of souls in despair being dragged off to hell, with the power of 1,000 horns sounding the start of a medieval battle rung through the fields. Its volume caused flocks of birds in the nearby trees to fly away in panic. Its bass shuddered through my chest and left me too hypnotized to pull the trigger. I'll never get used to hearing one of them scream. Okay, here we go, I muttered to myself, the only thought I could conjure from my brain at the moment. Closing its mouth, It leapt forward and reached for the ground in front of it with its hands fixed like claws. As soon as they met the ground, the feet followed and planted themselves quickly so that it could boost itself forward once again. It had begun to charge at me. All the while, its face remained fixed on me, rotting teeth exposed and clenched in rage. The speed at which it rushed across the empty field would make a deer running for its life look lazy in comparison. But I was the prey here. Though my heart began to race at the sight of this abomination barreling toward me, this anomaly of hatred and hunger bound to flesh, I remained calm. I began to steady my breathing, taking control of each breath in and out. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The crack of the shot rang out through the dimming sky and the field before me, my response to its enraged scream. I remained fixed on the target, observing the spatter of blood as it shot from its back. It began to scream again, this time rapidly and desperate in tone. I quickly moved the bolt and chambered the next round, accompanied by the soft ring of the brass bouncing off the floorboards under my chair. Although I managed to land a clean shot to the chest, it didn't do much. It kept running, keeping on at its same speed. Though now it changed its direction and was running adjacent to my position in the house. It was trying to flank me. I couldn't let it. Again, I took control of my breathing. Slowly, I drifted my rifle on the bipod until the creature came back into view. Its limbs pounded at the ground with speed and power as it propelled itself across the field. I'll never get used to seeing one run either. Starting behind it, I continued to move the scope, just fast enough to begin gaining on him. Just fast enough to let the crosshairs catch up. Inhale, exhale. The crosshairs slowly began to overtake it. Inhale, exhale. Squeeze. I chambered the next round quickly. This shot brought him to the ground, but it didn't keep him there. After a short tumble, it rose and began to run again, this time back towards the woods it came from. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The third shot grazed its back. Frustrated, I chambered another round and took aim, but it was far too late. Before I could even begin to line up my fourth shot, it had taken one final leap from the field back into the tree line it came from. I let out a sigh and hung my head in disappointment. I knew what I had to do next, but I sure as hell didn't want to. The last flickers of sunlight shone through the open window and lit my rifle as I reloaded the magazine. I sat and stared blankly at the screen in front of me, hoping a camera would pick up some sort of movement that could clue me into wherever it ran off to. Knowing my luck, I shouldn't have expected it to. After coming to terms with reality, I stood up and got my firearms ready. Next, I adjusted the night vision set to my head and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, I let out another sigh, this one of stress. Hunting these things at night on their own turf is never as fun nor as easy as finishing them quickly from a distance. But what choice did I have? I just wanted to get this over with. I flipped down my goggles and switched them on, illuminating the dark field in green and white. I began my long walk across. It took me longer than expected. The speed of that monstrosity caused me to underestimate the size of the field. Each step I took was slow and quiet. I didn't want the crunch of my feet meeting the dirt and remnants of corn stalks to disturb my hearing. If that thing made a noise, I needed to hear it. If only I could have quieted my breathing too. I wasn't even halfway to the tree line when I reached the first pool of blood, where I'd shot it for the second time, and it decided to retreat. Bits of flesh were scattered about the ground, but I didn't care to stop and look. Instead, I focused on the blood I could see that led back into the woods. Now, any experienced hunter has had to track a deer or two. It can be very frustrating. The trail isn't always so clear, and you never know how far it's gotten. In any case, I knew this thing was still alive, and it was angry. I continued my walk, splitting my attention between the blood trail on the ground and the tree line in front of me, scanning for movement and listening. If I was lucky enough, it would have gotten bold and tried to take me down in the field. Unfortunately, I'm not so lucky. Silently, I followed the trail until it met the woods. I stopped walking and calmed myself. I didn't want to go past those damn trees, but there was no avoiding it. I had a job to do. I extended the bipod of my gun and lowered it to the ground before raising the stock of my other rifle to my shoulder. I took a deep breath and resumed my walk, now even slower and more cautious. At least now my heavy breathing would be drowned out by the sound of snapping twigs beneath my feet. Immediately upon entering the woods, I spotted the next sign of blood. It came from a tree branch, its leaves covered in a dripping crimson liquid. I walked up to observe, only to notice more blood on the branch above that one. And the next. I noticed the pattern and followed each branch up one by one, with its leaves covered in blood. Suddenly, a mass moved on top of the tree next to the one I was looking up at. I swung my rifle up, pointing above me at the top of the trees. The mass turned, and I saw two glowing eyes like white lights in my night vision. It opened its mouth again to let out another deafening scream, but I raised my rifle and took aim. Its scream was cut short by a bang from my barrel and the thud of the rounds meeting flesh. I was only able to squeeze half a dozen rounds off before it leapt away to the tops of the neighboring trees. I kept shooting as it jumped from one tree to another, though within seconds it was out of my line of sight. I charged through the woods after it and watched it leap impossible distances, shaking trees so hard I thought they might snap. All the while, I kept trying and failing to line up a clean shot. The ones I did manage to squeeze off were either misses or ineffective. Even at the full-on sprint that I managed to sustain for a good few minutes, I was barely able to keep up. I almost abandoned the chase entirely before I saw an opportunity. There was a clearing ahead. Trail. The distance across was far too wide for it to jump. It took a sharp right once it realized this and began jumping from tree to tree along the trail. I rushed into the opening before kneeling to line up a shot. I followed it with my sights, tracking the timing of each leap and letting it land and leap once more before it settled on a new tree. I shot off 2 more rounds as it braced to leap again. They were perfectly placed, and its body tumbled in the air and crashed violently to the ground. Having lined up my sight, I squeezed the trigger again to hear the absence of a gunshot replaced by the click of a firing pin in the empty chamber. I screamed curses at myself as I quickly exchanged magazines. By the time I looked up, the body was already gone. I got to my feet and continued down the trail at a jog-like pace with my rifle at the ready. I was beginning to get frustrated more than anything. I've put dozens of these things in the ground before. I didn't understand why I was having such a hard time with this one. As I approached a curve in the trail, I slowed my pace and brought the stock of my rifle back to my shoulder. I approached the curve from the outside of the trail, trying to get a clear view of what was beyond when my head violently snapped to the left. My vision went suddenly dark, and it took me a few moments to realize that I wasn't dead nor was I unconscious. I am conscious. Something hit my night vision goggles and knocked them clear off my head, breaking the mount they sat on. My eyes were only beginning to adapt to the dark when another object came flying towards my head, narrowly missing as it whistled past my ear. It was a rock about the size of a football. I couldn't help but glance behind me in astonishment at the object that had nearly decapitated me before turning my attention back to what threw it. Sure enough, there was, standing behind the trees at the corner of the path. I let my anger take control, and I began to fire rapidly at its torso. My disregard for accuracy hardly mattered at this range. Regrettably, it meant I was now closer than I would have liked, and it began to charge. I landed shot after shot. Blood spurted from its back and painted the tree branches and leaves that it passed as it barreled towards me. Again, my magazine went empty. Instead of bothering to reload a new one, I quickly drew my Glock and continued my rapid fire on the beast. It broke into a clearing and fell to all fours before it leaped forward and ran as it had done in the field. It closed the distance between us in seconds. A hand clenched around my throat, and I was lifted off the ground like a feather. It kept running past the edge of the clearing and carrying me into the woods. I continued to pepper it at point-blank range with my pistol. Between shots, I could hear its hysterical laughter directed at my efforts. Its face smiled with a look of sadistic insanity. I continued shooting until my magazine went dry, and I was stuck with an empty gun. With nothing else I could do, I began to beat its face with the empty pistol. This seemed to piss it off. It violently threw me through the air. I felt my body snap dozens of branches before I met the ground and rolled uncontrollably. Recovering quickly, I grabbed the rifle still slung around me and replaced the empty magazine with a new one. It was mere feet away from me when I started to fire. I got a few shots off before it grabbed my arm. This time, though, I whipped the barrel of my rifle up, clubbing it hard across the face. It let out a short, irritated scream. I thrust my barrel at the top of its head, knocking it back as it emitted another angry grunt. It reached up with its left arm and tried to grab the barrel before half of its fingers were blown off by my next shot. It recoiled its arm in pain before swinging it back at me. Upon contact, my rifle flew out of my hands and the sling came undone from my body as it was thrown far into the woods behind me. I attempted to retreat before he grabbed me with his right hand and what remained of his left around my neck. Again, I was picked up and it carried me, this time only a short distance to a tree. My back cracked as I was slammed into the bark. It looked up at me and smiled again. We killed our sinners. It began. We brought justice to our land. We brought justice for God. I ignored its foul speech, lifting an arm and hooking it across its face with a firm punch. It did nothing. You're all sinners and you'll die for your sins as they did. Again, I struggled and pummeled its face with everything I could muster, but it still did nothing. Now go and burn in the lake of fire. It said before laughing with a dozen sadistic voices all coming from its mouth. It opened its mouth and its jaw was once again stretched to what should have been an impossible level. It lowered me until I was level with it. It moved its open mouth toward my head, shaking with rage, its teeth now inches from my face. With my left arm, I drew my knife, slashing it across its chest before plunging into its neck. I hooked a punch with my right arm that finally caused it to stumble. It wound up its own punch and let loose. I nearly escaped, ducking out of the way before its fist met the tree and went right through, splitting it in half before the wood tumbled to the ground. I took this opportunity to draw my .357. He recovered from its punch and faced me, pulling the knife from its neck and letting blood spurt and gush. It stared me down as it slowly approached. Its head was shaking now, harder than ever in anger. Its mouth hung open to half its capacity, where it showed its rows of rotting human teeth. I raised my revolver and attempted to steady my sights, but I was too shaky. I quickly collected myself. Inhale, exhale. The front sight became level with the rear. Squeeze. The recoil caused the gun to rise enough for me to get a good look at the damage. I clipped its mouth and the corner of its jaw. It hung open with one side detached completely. It wailed in pain as it gargled its blood and crumpled to the ground. I aimed again. Squeeze. With a second round, I detached its jaw completely. Let's see you bite me now, I said. It dropped my knife and was now laying flat on its back, breathing heavily. I approached, cocking the revolver again as I did. It reached out with its mangled hand, but I kicked it away before placing my barrel to its skull. Squeeze. And then silence. After dragging the body back to the field, I spent the next few hours retrieving my lost and damaged equipment, as well as tediously finding every one of my cameras. I then retrieved my vehicle and drove it to the edge of the field. There was just one more thing to do. I opened my trunk and pulled out the metallic box. I don't understand why they make these things so heavy. I opened it and placed the corpse inside before securing the extremely heavy-duty lock. Next was the hole. It wasn't exactly easy digging after I'd been roughed up and tossed around by an undead religious maniac with superhuman strength, but at least this was the last thing I had to do. I finished digging the hole, placed the metal casket inside, and covered up. From there, I collected my equipment, packed it up, and took off. Supposedly, there's a cleanup crew that comes in after we're done with these missions and destroys any bizarre evidence. I suspect they take the body as well. Where do they take it? What do they do with it? I have no clue, but I've been strictly reminded to not ask questions on the matter, and to just stick to doing my job. Still, I always find myself wondering. What I have even more questions about is why these things exist in the first place. What the hell's going on? Why them? Why now? Has this been going on for longer than I know? Am I being lied to? What happens next in the future if this keeps going on? It's only been getting worse. They've only been popping up more and more frequently. When does it end? Does it end? I have more questions than I do answers, but what I can tell you is that this problem isn't going away anytime soon. It's only going to get worse. There are only going to be more of them, not less. The death toll will only continue to rise. People are going to find out sooner or later. Might as well be now. Maybe we will stop them. Maybe this will all come to an end one day. Or maybe we are the ones who are all going to meet our end. Either way, I'll be there to see it.